Welcome to our daily reflection for this Sunday, October 26th. And of course, every Sunday is the Lord's Day, the day of the resurrection. So it's a day of joy, a day of rejoicing in the Lord and resting in Him and drawing ever closer to His sacred heart. That's what we want to do every Sunday, is draw closer to God, invest not in the work of the world, but in the eternal work of relationships. First and foremost with God, by prayer, spending extra time in prayer, and relationships with family and friends. Let's invest in those relationships. And speaking of relationships, the readings today are all about listening and being heard. And have you ever had somebody talking to you and you just weren't paying much attention? Maybe you're watching a movie or a screen, or you're listening to something, or you're watching, you've got your phone and you're just distracted by that screen. I try to put my phone and screens away on Sundays, on the Lord's Day, so I'll put that back down and out of the way. But it's the idea is that you're looking at something and you're absorbed in that, and then someone's talking to you and you're kind of half listening, but you're not really listening. And conversely, how frustrating it is when you're trying to talk to somebody and you're trying to relate something important, significant, and they're not really listening. Do you remember experiencing that and how frustrating that is and how disappointing? Well, in the Word of God today, God tells us that He is attentive to us. He's not distracted. He's got a lot of things on His plate. He is attentive to us. And He tells us exactly how He is most attentive to us and how we can be heard by God. Maybe your friends, maybe your family members are too busy and distracted with screens and busyness of life to really listen to you, for you to be heard. But God is ready to listen. He wants to be heard. And so He says in the first reading from the wisdom book of Sirach, that God hears the cry of those who are oppressed. He's not deaf to the wail of the orphan. And that the one who serves God willingly, right? Not reluctantly, not begrudgingly, not out of duty, but out of generosity, out of willingness. The person who serves God willingly, his petition reaches heaven. God hears. God takes their call, so to speak. And the prayer of the humble, right, the lowly, pierces the clouds. So we are heard when we're humble, when we're oppressed, when we're orphaned, when we're hurting, and we cry out to God. He hears us. He hears us. And I love that imagery, the prayer of the humble or the lowly, it pierces the heavens, and it doesn't rest until it reaches its goal, nor will it withdraw till the Most High responds. There's a great promise, right? That's a beautiful promise. And then Psalm 34 reiterates this theme. The Lord hears the cry of the poor, right? And, it's about, look, I'm going to bless the Lord at all times, but He is close to the brokenhearted and to those who are crushed, right? He is with them and He saves them. And this relates to what Paul's going to confess in his letter to Timothy, because Paul writes at the end of his life, he knows he's imprisoned and he's about to be executed. And he writes to Timothy and he says, look, I'm being poured out like a libation. I'm about to be sacrificed. So he uses an imagery of the temple, of a wine libation being poured out. He's like, I'm about to be poured out. And it's true, Paul will be beheaded and his blood will be poured out. So he is going to be like a libation. And the time of my exodus, my departure is at hand. And I've competed well and I've run the race. And I love that. Paul has no regrets, right? That's what we want at the end of our life, to have no regrets, because we had the right relationship with God and the right relationship with our friends and family members. Boy, what a liberation if we can run the race and say, you know what? I've got good relationships with everybody. I'm ready, Lord, take me. What a beautiful place to be. And that Paul's in that, right? And then he goes on and says, the crown of justice awaits me. And, and then he talks about how he was put on trial, and on his first trial, his first hearing, no one appeared on his behalf, right? And, he was kind of abandoned, and that's a dark place to be. But just like the Psalm says, right, that God hears the cry of the humble and the oppressed, and it says, but the Lord stood by me, right? No one was there for me, but the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, right? God hears the prayer of those in need, those who serve Him willingly. And Paul served God willingly. And Paul was oppressed. He was crushed, right? And and yet God is with him. And then Paul then says, I was able to make a proclamation of the gospel to the Gentiles, and I was rescued from the lion's mouth, and God will rescue me from every evil. Even though he knows he's going to die, being rescued from every evil doesn't mean God's going to spare you of suffering or death. He just knows, as he says, and God will bring me safe to his heavenly kingdom. He knows what really matters is escaping from the evil of the devil and of hell and sin and being taken into the heavenly refuge when he dies. And so that's a beautiful prayer of trusting. And then the gospel is all about true, authentic prayer to God with humility and lowliness versus those who come entitled and with arrogance. And we have a Pharisee who prays, but he despises everybody else because he thinks he's so righteous. And what we see here is pride that looks down on others versus humility that looks up to others, right? How do you know if you're proud or if you're humble? If you're always looking up to others, you're humble. Humility means we see others as more important than ourselves. And the proud sees themselves as more important than others. And that's a subtle way to understand how pride and humility work, but an important one. And then we get this beautiful tax collector who comes in to the temple and he prays to God with his head bent low. He beats his breast and he prays, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." What a beautiful prayer for us to memorize and say to God, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." That is the prayer of a humble, lowly heart. And if we have that prayer, our prayer will pierce the heavens and will not come back empty. So let's make that prayer with all humility today. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.